It was May 1873 when the first domino in a long economic chain fell halfway across the world from South Bend, Indiana. The Vienna Stock Exchange crashed, bankrupting businesses, individuals, and entire railroad empires. The whispers of panic would spread throughout the Eastern Hemisphere, cratering economies in Britain, India, South Africa, and the Ottoman Empire. By the end of 1873, the stink of recession had spread all the way to New York, shuttering banks, closing up factories, and sending more than 100 railroad ventures across the United States into insolvency. The economies of most of America's biggest cities followed right behind, and the economies of most of its small towns followed right behind those. By the end of 1873, most of America was buried in a full-blown depression, but not South Bend. Studebaker, Singer, and Oliver had driven enough growth in the young city to keep South Bend well above water, even when a lot of other similar-sized cities were drowning. The newspapers applauded the investment of the community-minded businessmen and cheered for the shrewd governance of its mayors and councilmen. South Bend remained prosperous. Its railroads remained open and connected. Its citizens remained healthy and employed. There was some thought that maybe the city had dodged a global depression, but by 1876, its leaders had come to realize that although they'd forestalled the thing, they hadn't avoided it. It was a new challenge for a city barely 10 years old, and Alexander Napier Thomas was the new man in the mayor's chair elected to oversee it. By the end of his first year in office, he'd realize he didn't really want to sit there anymore. Hello and welcome to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. I'm your host, Aaron Hellman, and during this 8-episode series, we're going to dive into the dawn of the city of South Bend, the first 25 years after its incorporation, through the lens of its first 8 mayors. During the course of this episode, you'll hear fictional advertisements for very real historical companies and products. We do that to help break up the podcast, provide some levity, to include just a little more history than we could otherwise, and to give you a sense of the time and place when and where all of this is happening. The absence of actual paid advertisements is made possible by the generous underwriting of all 8 episodes in this series by Andy and Tina Nickel of South Bend. And now, with all that out of the way, let's jump into the life and times and administration of Alexander Napier Thomas, a reluctant and complicated mayor of South Bend who forgot the city almost as soon as he left it, and for its part, much of the city forgot him too. Alexander Napier Thomas was born in 1839 in Philadelphia and moved with his family to South Bend when he was 14 years old. The Thomas clan established a homestead just outside of town and lent their own family names to the dirt roads that straddled their land. Napier and Thomas streets demarcated the place Thomas grew up, and those names remain today, although as we'll learn a little later, it would take some work to keep it that way. Since Alexander Napier Thomas was a mouthful, and since newspaper ads charged by the letter, Thomas began going by his initials and became known throughout the city as A.N. Thomas. He enlisted to fight during the Civil War, mustered in at Camp Rose in South Bend in 1862, and saw action at Perryville and Stones River before the year was out. In 1863, his unit met defeat at the hands of the Confederates during a failed raid on a southern railroad line. Thomas and more than 1,500 of his comrades were captured at Rome, Georgia, and held as Confederate prisoners for 19 months, marched back and forth from prisoner camps in Georgia and South Carolina. Toward the end of 1864, as the South became more desperate for troops, most of the Confederates assigned to guard the prisoners were called to the front lines. Thomas would later recollect his exit from capture as an escape, but it's far more likely that there just wasn't anyone left to stop them from leaving. Either way, by November 1864, Thomas was back with his unit. and by July 1865, he was mustered out of his service, then returned to South Bend to begin living a civilian life. Thomas was quick to make up for lost time upon his return from the field. He quickly joined the Masons, opened a real estate business, built a house on Lafayette Street, and married Addie Hodgkinson. The newspapers celebrated the nuptials with a sarcastic air, writing, "We have long known our friend Thomas, and like all reliable good fellows as he is, he bears acquaintance. Having once been taken prisoner by the rebels and escaped, he has again become a captive, but this time to one of the most beautiful and accomplished young ladies of this city, and we opine that from such a captivity our friend will not seek to escape." Thomas was busy building a career and a family while South Bend's first mayors did their work, but maybe he was always destined for public service. He was a Republican, a veteran, a prisoner of war, prominent in the city, and well-liked by all of the right people. In 1868, he launched his political career when he ran for and won the office of St. Joseph County Recorder, an office he would hold for 3 terms. And that might have been where his political career ended, too. But for the calamity of South Bend's 1874 election, Alexander Napier Thomas, of course, ran for city council as a Republican, and that's where the politics stopped being so straightforward. South Bend's People's Party had split tickets across the city, and in Thomas's second ward, that made him one Republican running against a pair of Democrats. When those Democrats split the vote, Thomas won his seat on South Bend City Council with less than 40% of the vote. As a councilman, Thomas aligned himself with Mayor William Miller, working directly with the mayor's office to sell waterworks bonds throughout the city. Despite his standing as a fiscally conservative Republican, Thomas even sat on the Ways and Means Committee and recommended a slight increase in property taxes, all the way from 1% to 1.1%. Thomas established himself as the echo of a very popular sitting mayor, and whether he did that in order to position himself for the office, or just because it's where his politics best lined up, it all had the effect of making Thomas the most obvious candidate to replace Miller in the mayor's chair. There was just the matter of the election standing in his way, and we'll get to that right after the break. The Knobloch Brothers store is here for your undertaking needs in the best possible manner and at the best possible rates. Knobloch Brothers has all kinds of wood and metallic coffins and caskets, kept on hand or made to order. But that's not all. Knobloch Brothers also has parlor sets, chamber sets, dining tables, hat racks, desks, whatnots, and of course, baby carriages, cribs, and cradles. Located at 75 Main Street, Knobloch Brothers has you covered from cradle to grave. Literally. And now, back to A Bend in Time, brought to you by the History Museum. In 1876, just ahead of the city's election cycle, Alexander Napier Thomas passed the bar and began practicing law. It was a helpful step for an aspiring mayoral candidate because it meant that Thomas could serve as the city's judge pro tempore when needed. For as much as South Bend had grown, a good mayor still had to wear an awful lot of hats. In May 1876, with the city returned to its traditional 2 parties, Thomas won the nomination of the Republican Convention and breezed through the general election, becoming the 4th mayor of South Bend and, according to Wikipedia, the first one who didn't have an insane beard. It's uncertain if Thomas actively sought and desired the mayor's office, or if he merely acquiesced to the wishes of his friends and party, an inevitable next step in his journey of public service. Whatever it was, his enthusiasm for the job seemed to vanish almost as quickly as he began it. For the first 11 years of South Bend's history, the mayor's job had been nothing if not eventful. There was the matter of a whole city to build. The place needed taxes and a budget and a staff. It needed paved roads and sidewalks. It needed defined borders. It needed police and firefighters. It needed railroads. It needed streetlights and bridges. It needed running water. That's a lot to build from scratch in just 10 years, but somehow South Bend had done it. Now, all it had to do was to maintain the status quo, and maintaining the status quo is a lot less fun to do. Besides all of that, America's long depression had finally made its way to South Bend, putting people out of work, driving wages down, slowing growth, discouraging business investment, and torpedoing the city's already meager budget along with it. Alexander Napier Thomas had inherited a city that didn't have any big exciting projects to work on, and it didn't really matter, because the city didn't have the money to work on them either. Thomas did the work that was required of him. He kept the streetlights lit, he made sure gutters stayed clean, and he sat in judgment whenever necessary, including on May 18, 1876, when he banished a one-legged drunkard to Niles, Michigan. As president of the local Temperance Society, Thomas had little patience for the city's drunks, and as substitute judge, he had plenty of cause to deal with them. The work of the city was as slow as the national economy, and in some months the mayor would spend more time lecturing intoxicated men than anything else. The only new construction that he oversaw numbered just a handful of brick sewers, beginning with a 4-foot construct that ran along Michigan Street between Washington and LaSalle. It wasn't exactly the kind of dynamic city building that his predecessors had done. So Thomas poured himself into other pursuits. Besides the Temperance Society, he was also an in-demand lecturer on the Sunday school circuit throughout northern Indiana, appearing in Fort Wayne and Valparaiso to train new groups of Sunday school teachers how to gain and keep the attention of students. In July 1876, on the centennial anniversary of the nation, Thomas departed for Washington, D.C. for the better part of a month. When he came back, he found another project to give his energy to, doing the important work of helping the destitute families of South Bend who'd been ruined by the nation's economic turmoil. It was no doubt a worthy venture, but he'd have to take off his mayor's hat to do it. It wasn't through any arm of the government that Alexander Napier Thomas would serve the impoverished, and the young city code provided almost no levers that he could have pulled if he wanted to. Besides forgiving unpaid taxes on a case-by-case basis, the council had no provision for welfare programs. If the hungry were to be fed, it would be someone else's job to feed them. Thomas spent the last part of his first year in office organizing churches, fraternal organizations, and social clubs, throwing what he called a union festival to raise donations of cash, food, and clothing for poor families throughout South Bend. Now, if you're wondering if the people of South Bend noticed that their mayor was spending most of his time and energy on extracurricular pursuits, you should know that they absolutely did. An angry letter to the Register lambasted Thomas for spending so much energy on the Union Festival when he was receiving a salary to do the work of the government, not to coordinate the work of the church. Thomas was a mayor whose paycheck came from taxes, not a pastor whose paycheck came from tithes. Thomas wrote back in the paper, arguing that he had fulfilled his governmental duties and pointing out that he had a role in the city besides being a mayor. He was also a citizen and a Christian, and one who had no qualms about using his platform to try to do right by the hungry and naked. If it hadn't happened already, maybe this was the moment when Thomas fully soured on the mayorship. After spending his first year of public service doing mostly nothing because that's what the budget demanded, he'd finally tackled a big and unwieldy community service project at Christmas time that was going to help people, and he was getting creamed for it. Alexander Napier Thomas started to look elsewhere. He started to look west. By 1877, the West was accessible and open for business. George Custer had been wiped out at the Battle of Little Bighorn a year earlier, sparking an American vengeance that saw forced migrations of tribal people away from the little land they had left. The major Indian chiefs were dropping like flies. Sitting Bull fled to Canada. Crazy Horse surrendered in Nebraska. The West had always been attractive for pioneering Americans. Now it was being made safe. That brought dozens of new railroads to connect the Midwest to the other side of the Mississippi, and hosts of Americans found their curiosities about that great river stoked when Mark Twain published The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. 1877 brought a small bit of excitement to South Bend in the form of a telegraph wire that ran through a handful of homes, including the mayor's own house. Like a pair of children, Thomas and Clem Studebaker spent a week shooting inane messages back and forth just because they could, and then the shine dulled on that new toy too. Meanwhile, growing divisions in national politics watched over a fraught presidential election that ended with an unsatisfying compromise that finally declared Rutherford B. Hayes the next president just 2 days before he was inaugurated. Despite losing the popular vote and holding fewer electoral votes than his opponent, the Republican Hayes was installed as president in a kind of brokered deal. The cost of that deal was that the Republicans effectively agreed to end Reconstruction efforts in the South. In northern Indiana, the blow was felt doubly hard. Schuyler Colfax had been a proud Reconstructionist. Those national divisions didn't trickle down to South Bend. The city was still governed under a Republican supermajority, and that's who Mayor Thomas addressed in May 1877 during his annual executive speech. Thomas came armed with ideas, proposing that the council consider building a city prison or prisoner workhouse. It was the kind of project an ambitious young mayor might be able to sink his teeth into. The council never acted on that suggestion. He also redoubled his call for churches to work together to provide a social safety net for their city's most vulnerable citizens. The churches listened where the council wouldn't. There's really not much blame to go around here, and it's hard to say that any of this was anyone's fault. A global depression was a circumstance beyond any government's purview. Without a healthy tax base to stoke the fire, there was no engine to push big projects. And anyway, the city didn't need them. The place had just about everything a city of its size needed, except maybe a city park, but then that wasn't exactly a project for a depression. South Bend was a ball that just needed to be kept rolling, and it was okay if the ball rolled a little slower for a while, so long as it didn't stop. And what you can say for Alexander Napier Thomas is that, well, he kept the ball rolling. At least when he was in town. And after the break, we're going on a journey with Alexander Napier Thomas to a wild, magical land somewhere beyond the Mississippi River. J.H. Green & Brothers, located at 97 Main Street and in connection with their grocery, have opened a first-class bakery featuring fresh bread, pies, cakes, rolls, and rusks, all of the best quality and at the lowest prices. Bread and pastries can be delivered fresh anywhere in the city, and their grocery prices are the cheapest in town. And now, back to A Bend in Time presented by the History Museum. By August 1873, Thomas had departed on a month-long expedition to the west, and maybe he didn't know it yet, but he was absolutely going to leave his heart there. Thomas wrote about the incomparable beauty of the area he visited, the colorful horizons and skyscapes and vistas, waxed poetically with $5 words and flowery adjectives that might have described the mountains of Colorado, the grandeur of the Grand Canyon, or the spectacle of the Pacific coast, but in all cases, he was only ever talking about Nebraska. Somehow, Alexander Napier Thomas had fallen in love with Nebraska, and he would make a pair of return trips to that state before his time as mayor of South Bend was over. Of the last 6 months of his tenure, Thomas spent 3 of them in Nebraska. And what of the South Bend he left behind? Well, the churches stepped up. They heeded the mayor's call, organizing hasty relief societies, throwing fairs and fundraisers, and generally doing everything in their power to care for the least of these, the way Thomas had hoped they would. The city council kept the ball rolling the way they were supposed to. The police broke up many of the accoutrements of economic depressions, raiding illegal saloons, breaking up gambling rings, and cracking down on local pimps. In the midst of all that, the police made a few enemies, and although none were cut down in the line of duty, it wasn't for lack of trying from the criminals. And you'd be correct if you're thinking that it might not have been a good look for a city's mayor to be gone for a month while people were shooting at its cops. Critics panned Thomas for that, too. But in the midst of the tumult of the Long Depression of the 1870s, there was good news in South Bend, although maybe it was good luck more than anything else. Some 150 railroad enterprises had shut down across America between 1873 and 1878, dotting the nation with strings of unfinished lines that would never be completed, never deliver the prosperity that they'd promised to the cities they were supposed to connect, and bringing financial ruin to the towns who'd invested fortunes into them. Hundreds of municipalities across America that might have been competitors to places like South Bend were stymied in a moment, victims of a failed chance that they would never get again. Especially east of the Mississippi, the end of the 1870s proved a kind of delineation. If you weren't an established town with railroad connectivity by then, you were probably never going to be one. They couldn't have known it, but South Bend had slipped in just in time. Then there was the matter of the already completed railroads, because some of those companies went out of business too, leaving their lines bereft of traffic. Thriving cities that had been connected no longer were. And without the ability to ship goods beyond their borders, recovering from the Long Depression would take even longer. Some of those cities never did recover. South Bend wasn't one of them. All of its railroads stayed afloat. When South Bend started its next ascension during the 1880s, it was largely thanks to the unbroken continuity of its railroad networks. Of course, Alexander Napier Thomas was responsible for none of those things, and in fairness, a highly active and present mayor would not have been responsible for any of those things either. As South Bend moved toward a new voting cycle in 1878, Thomas did not announce that he would not be seeking re-election, and he did not need to. The newspapers did not print the pleas of his friends and constituents begging him to stay, because those pleas never came. It wasn't necessarily that they thought Thomas was a bad mayor. It's just that they had a pretty good idea of where his heart was, and it wasn't in South Bend, Indiana anymore. A week before the end of his term, the Thomases threw a party at their home, gathering the outgoing city council and each of the city's first four mayors, William George, Lewis Humphreys, William Miller, and of course, Alexander Napier Thomas. The party was many things: a farewell to the Thomases who would soon be out of town, a thank you to many of the governmental leaders who had been so involved since the beginning, and a celebration of everything that the comparatively small group had accomplished in 13 years. Remember, South Bend had been late to incorporate. In 1865, they were arguably positioned worse than LaPorte, Elkhart, Goshen, Plymouth, and Mishawaka. And then, by 1878, they were established as the dominant city in the region and had already weathered massive political turmoil and a national depression. Against all odds, South Bend had made it. They'd built, maintained, endured, and while the job wasn't over yet, maybe it was finally time to hand the reins over to someone else. The next years would bring about a significant changing of South Bend's political guard. The Republican stranglehold on local politics was on its last legs, the curse of a party that happened to be in power during a crippling global depression. The party at the Thomas House marked the beginning of a political sunset, but by the time that Republican sun dipped behind the horizon, Thomas wouldn't be there to see it. Even before his term ended, Thomas had been recruiting pioneers to travel westward with him to establish a St. Joseph colony in Nebraska. Plans were drawn, rosters were assembled, supplies were purchased, and a year after he left the mayor's seat, Thomas left South Bend for good, settling briefly in Seward, Nebraska, before landing in Aurora, where he pastored a church, practiced law, served as postmaster, and served exactly one term as that city's mayor. He returned to South Bend in 1884 amid some controversy in order to fight the decision to rename his family's Thomas Street, a thoroughfare originally named after the ex-mayor's father. Under the bright new glow of the newly christened Milburn Chapel, there was a movement to strip Thomas Street of its name and to rechristen it as Milburn, named after the same Studebaker in-law who the beautiful new church had been named after. Despite protest, the measure passed, and the road was renamed on February 12, 1884. But it was far from a done deal. Anger would continue for months, and it was in the midst of a protest. Angry protests would continue for months, and it was in the midst of these that Thomas arrived in South Bend. Finally, just as the city teetered on the edge of fiery chaos, there came word that a legal loophole had been discovered. Apparently, according to an arcane but superseding state law, there was no legal recourse for South Bend to change the names of any roads that had been placed and named in the years before South Bend was incorporated as a city. This included both Thomas and Napier Streets. It might have seemed in this moment of legal euphoria that Thomas Street had been restored, but the commissioners, for no known reason but probably a partisan one, decided to dig in their heels. Alexander Napier Thomas, who had already fought in one civil war and was not eager for a second, sought a truce, but his name carried little weight in this new South Bend. But where Thomas's voice faltered, the voice of Clem Studebaker would certainly carry. In a generous letter that would bring an end to the debate, Studebaker declared that Thomas Street should remain. "We are satisfied that if Mr. Thomas, for whom the street was originally named, and Father Milburn, both of whom have gone to their final rest, could be called to a council over the matter, they would be pained to have any feeling created over the question and would say, 'Let us have peace.'" That settled the issue, but if his time in the mayor's office hadn't soured Thomas on South Bend for good, this ordeal certainly did. By any account, it doesn't appear that he ever returned. Alexander Napier Thomas is buried in Aurora, Nebraska, and recognized as one of that city's founding fathers. But there are no streets named after him there. As for South Bend, they continued to forget about Mayor Thomas in the years to come. On January 21, 1885, the South Bend Tribune noted that all of the city's living mayors and ex-mayors had been in attendance at a reception at the Oliver residence. They left Thomas, very much alive, off of the list. The short article concluded with a sentence that said, "South Bend has been a city for 20 years, and in that time it's had 6 mayors, but by 1885, they'd actually had 7. You already know which one they forgot to count." Hey, thanks for joining us on A Bend in Time presented by the History Museum in South Bend. There's more history waiting for you at historymuseumsb.org. I'm your host, Aaron Hellman. The theme music is Whose Distance Is It Anyway by Neil Carmichael. Thanks to Andy and Tina Nickel of South Bend for underwriting this episode and all 8 episodes in our Dawn of the City series. Our next episode will pick up where this one left off, with South Bend's 5th mayor, Lucius Tong, and I hope you'll tune in for that one next. Until then, keep learning new things, and remember, everything is fascinating as long as you stay curious.